We're going to talk about death in today's episode. If you have recently experienced a loss or are sensitive when it comes to conversations on death, please feel free to skip this one. For me, today's episode is important because I don't think we talk about death enough, especially the technical and logistical part of death, like how does one's economic status affect the conditions in which they die? Do gender identities play a role in how people receive end-of-life care? Can we choose the memories that we want to leave behind for our loved ones? And how does social media become an archive of one's life after passing? With the support of the Graham Foundation for Advanced Studies in the Fine Arts, we speak to artist and professor of contemporary art at University of Oxford, Oreet Ashery, about death in the digital age. I am Vaissnavi Shukla, and this is Architecture of Center, a podcast where we highlight contemporary discourses that shape the built environment but do not occupy the center stage in our daily lives. We speak to radical designers, thinkers, and changemakers who are deeply engaged in redefining the way we live and interact with the world around us.
As long as you can hear me, I think we're good to start.
Okay, I can hear you.
Okay, so Oreet, I was thinking about revisiting Genesis, and before we get into the details of your project and your research and your practice, I thought we could start with revisiting Genesis, and if you can talk about the origins, the ideas, the expression that you've explored in revisiting Genesis. And I think what struck to me, especially while watching it, was the very possibility of all of it coming true. It was almost like Black Mirror-ish. So if you just want to get us started with that project.
The origin of Revisiting Genesis, I guess it was a kind of intersection of a number of things that took place and kind of collided together into this. So one of them was that I reached the age of 50 and I was just looking through my boxes in my office at old photographs, and I picked 10 photographs that I kind of was drawn to, and I wrote a short section about each one, just as a way for myself, just as a way of sort of reflecting on my life around that time, and kind of getting to that kind of particular age. And as I started to write about it, I started to think about memory, and I started to think about life cycles, and I started to understand that even though I thought that I kind of invent the wheel every time in my practice, actually it's not the case. It's actually quite cyclical and quite interconnected, and that there is a trajectory in the practice and everything is connected. So I just felt more integrated in myself. And that idea I later was echoed in when I was later on when I conceived of the work and I started to talk to doctors and nurses, particularly people who are working with dementia. The idea of showing pictures or showing or playing music to patients or people who experience issues with memory and with dementia, that kind of narrating your life, storytelling, really helped the sense of integration. So I started to think about memory as an identity and the role that memory plays in how we perceive ourselves. So that was one thing. Another thing was that my brother died in 2008, and I guess it took me all these years later to be able to, like people say that every 7 years we kind of like enter another spiritual phase in our life. And I guess it was 7 years later that I started to think about his death in relation to making work about death, really, and how he died. And because it affected me, because after he died, I found myself for years living in that preparedness. I was always preparing to die. So I've cleaned everything. I've left kind of notes to people, like not a will as such, but I started to really think about what we leave behind and what does that mean to people, kind of loved one around us when that happened. Another thing was that I started to notice on the internet, on Facebook, people starting to use the medium of Facebook to talk about their death. Particularly the artist Alexis Hunter recorded her death on right till the end. I think right until maybe 24 hours or 48 hours before she died. Her time at the hospice, and memorializing also her practice in relation to that. That affected me quite deeply. She's quite an under-recognized feminist practitioner. That affected me a lot. Another friend recorded Ian White, was dying at the time, kind of an amazing writer, thinker, curator in London. But also Facebook itself started to do these pop-ups where they remind you of people. And then, as it happened, one of them was somebody who died, and I started to think around that. What happens when you're being called to think of somebody in the middle of your day and that person actually died? So I started to think of Facebook as a kind of graveyard, and started to read about that. And there was a lot of writing around ideas around sort of exactly that, the sort of the death industry in Facebook. So all these things started to come together. It was also, I made this work in 2016, and it was also kind of the era of the kind of web series. So it was suddenly people started to move away from watching TV into watching various kind of web series as entertainment on the laptops and that. So I was curious what artists might do with that genre of the web series, taking away from entertainment into something probably slightly a bit perhaps heavier. And it's true that at some point I did look at Black Mirror. I was only interested in one episode where I think someone's boyfriend died and come back. So I was interested in how they're portraying him.
It was in this house where they had like a life-sized version of that person reliving as a real person. Is it that one?
Yeah. And it was interesting because they didn't take it too far. He literally, the actor looked like himself. They made him slightly paler, but it was him. But there was only one thing, something to do with, I think there was like a glass or something that went through his hand. There's a tiny bit of special effect, but it was very minimal. And for me, that made it more powerful because they didn't try to ghost him or to make any special effect. It literally was the same actor, the same person, her boyfriend, but we know that he's a kind of some kind of a digital ghost or something. So that kind of made me realize that I'm not going to make something that visually is going to look like futuristic in that sense of using special effects. That I was more interested in people's feelings and more interested in people's kind of emotions around how we die and how our death is then being memorialized online, and how we become virtual beings. The afterlife is on the internet, to portray it more from a humanistic perspective rather than kind of try to portray sort of technology and the digital world in this kind of high production way, because technology changes all the time. I didn't want the work to feel really dated in like 3 years' time. Be like people, oh yeah, in 2016 this is how it looked, but now it's completely different. I wanted to stay with those things that don't change so much, which is how we feel about things. So that was the origin, and then from then on, it's a very long answer to your question, but I'm just giving the whole overview. From then on, I went to write the script. It was 12 episodes, so it's quite an ambitious piece. So in a sense, it's 12 short films portraying the life of an artist who is possibly dying or disappearing or withdrawing. A friend's trying to help her through looking at series of slideshows of her work, trying to bring her back to life through that. And that was combined with interviews with real life, people with real life, life-limiting conditions. So people who have things like cystic fibrosis or cancer or brain aneurysm, different conditions, and how that affect their lives, but particularly how they thinking of death and archiving their lives in kind of digital archiving and posthumous ways of keeping in touch with the living. So that's the overview of the project, I guess.
So I'll be very honest and open in sharing this. So 2 days ago, my best friend lost her brother and had a massive cardiac arrest, and we were at the hospital, and he was very young, and unfortunately he did pass away. But it really made me think about what you're talking about in terms of the memories that you leave people with, right? And all these avenues in terms of how digital media becomes an almost archive of that person's life. And because I had just finished watching Revisiting Genesis a couple of days before that, it made me think about, the question of authorship when it comes to preparing or storing that memory or that digital archive, as what you call the slideshow in Revisiting Genesis, as something that a person who is receiving end-of-life care has the power and the authorship to curate a certain kind of archive or to select the memories that they would leave behind, versus in the format of a eulogy, where somebody who's not had any time to do that, somebody who's had an accidental death, the author is somebody else. Maybe it's a friend, maybe it's a family member who's curating their whole different set of memories that, they present as what they remember of this person in the absence of a certain kind of archive. And I've never really thought about this as artistic project of sorts, but I've been thinking about that question of authorship and its relationship to memory or even end-of-life care. And I would love to know what you think about the origin of such an archive, or whatever we call it, even if that's a Facebook page or an Instagram page, or which might not be made with a specific purpose of leaving behind memories. I mean, something as intentional as you mentioned, writing letters to people because you're preparing to leave, and you want to address that. But otherwise, if in case of like an accidental death or something, it's just whatever digital footprint you've already left ends up becoming their archive. And platforms do aid in creating those, right? Because Facebook, I remember, I've deleted Facebook, but there was an option of selecting a legacy contact. So in case you pass away, Facebook allowed you to nominate somebody who would become your legacy contact. What do you think about just this whole idea of authorship and of memory and just the emergence of these archives?
Yeah, this is a great question, and this is a lot of the whole, because the area of digital death, it's kind of generally, this area has been termed digital death, and it's a new area, so relatively new, so an emergent area. So there've been so many kind of discussions in terms of kind of ethically and legally around all that. So there is a number of things. So for example, with Facebook, there's a whole sort of debate, particularly around the very painful area of teenage suicide, where parents want access to the Facebook of their child who passed away, whether that should be allowed or not, so they can find out what happened, for example. Different people with different opinions call for different legislation of either protecting families in a sense of allowing access, like legacy contacts, allowing access to people's life after they passed away. And then the other way, where people wanting to protect people's privacy and saying, no, nobody should be able to do that. And of course, within that, there are issues because we do leave that behind. So in a sense, if traditionally you'd have like material things, and some of us are lucky enough to have those, even if it's a laptop or even if it's like, let's say, people pass away. What do you do with that laptop? Or some people have, property, or what you leave behind, really, what we leave behind, and especially creative professionals who, a lot of people, their property is intellectual and digital, but there could be a lot of it, of valuable, emotionally valuable, psychologically valuable, intellectually valuable content, and what happens to that? So I'd say in response, that there have been and there are a lot of debates around that. Also, not so much in relation to death, but just generally, we're entering this kind of new phase now where children who were portrayed on social media are now starting to sue the parents, because now they reach the age of 18. They're starting to sue the parents who did that without permission, without consent, because once you do that, when you start documenting your kind of child's everyday life, obviously that content just stays forever. So what happens with that? So all those kind of ethical questions, I think, quite urgent and quite debatable in different ways. And obviously there are darker sides to it in different ways when people want to find out what happened to people who, let's say, maybe were murdered by somebody who was very close to them. Or, for example, I read at the time when I was researching a few articles about a woman who lost her partner, her husband, and she felt uncomfortable with everything that was online remaining of him, and wanted to kind of clean it up, sort of have a closure, and hired a company, I think Swedish company, that kind of promised her that they can do that. They can literally clean the remains of that person virtually. And she described that process and how long it took and how difficult it is to actually do that in reality. You know, there are some books been written about kind of exactly that, about how we should be conscious of our kind of, what do they call it? The kind of the crumbs that we leave, that almost like showing the way to something. You know, we leave in so many traces that we might want to be more private about. Again, all that is just constantly evolving, and our kind of right to privacy has been massively compromised more and more. So the discussions are kind of changing all the time, clearly, you know, with kind of data harvesting and all that. I think the sort of global level questions of authorship, but on a kind of more kind of domestic level, let's say, within this work, what I found out for myself and from talking to people researching it is that particularly for minorities, our control of legacy is very important. So we might kind of say, I can't be bothered to kind of archive all my materials, and that's why there's a part in the one of the episode where Genesis, the artist, the main character, is saying, it's a fictional character, kind of saying, my archive is a mess. It's like a mess. She's not saying it, her friends are saying. They're looking at her archive and it's like they're a mess. But in certain ways, because certain minority discourses are perhaps less heard, less documented, there's a kind of a particular knowledge that comes with certain discourses that is not within the dominant culture. But also in the area of how we die, how we live and how we die, that there is an importance in archiving. And a good case study of that was Barbara Hammer, the artist Barbara Hammer, who died quite recently, and they beautifully wrote and spoke about that need for archiving, and particularly for artists of the legacy, and particularly of minorities and outsiders and people where the stories are less heard. So for me, that was my kind of, I think I came into making the work kind of more cynically, looking at archiving more cynically, and coming out of the other end, I just thought actually those kind of self-curatorial or externally curatorial projects of archiving people's artist legacies are important. Also, what came up through filming and through talking to people who experience life-limiting conditions is that perhaps you don't have the energy to do that. When you feel like this, you're not thinking, I'm going to spend a day archiving. You know, you kind of want to do maybe other things. We also spoke about that kind of practical solutions, creative ways of archiving. What is an archive? What is the slideshow? What is a legacy? And some of it could be as simple as telling a friend something, like one of the nurses I spoke to a few experts, and she was a cancer nurse, and she said that she encountered this phenomena where people who she thought might die any minute didn't, and then they'll hold her hand and tell her in a few hours some either secrets or something important narratives from their lives, and then they could peacefully die. They allow themselves to die. So I think that needs to kind of have somebody witnessing your narrative or narratives is clearly very important in whatever way. But another aspect to the project was that in this emergent area is a lot of companies capitalizing on, and that was the point of it, of the critique of capitalism, was that while capitalism kind of extract from us when we're alive, it also now extracts from us when we die, because they give you this, different companies give you different kind of memorialization options. Like you can leave those kind of videos to your loved one, and they'll send it to them every year. Let's say 15 years, suddenly you'll get a video from somebody close to you who died telling you like happy birthday or something, or those kind of augmented reality AR, a hybrid tombstone where you can go to a grave and kind of log into someone's, let's call it slideshow or whatever online to enhance the experience of, because they're saying that people's visiting kind of cemeteries is declining, so it's to kind of enhance that experience, for example. Or they're kind of, those kind of legacy managers where they'll kind of take the password of everything and just keep your legacy, basically. So that, or the other side of it, like I explained the example, somebody who wants to actually get rid of everything as a legacy.
Clean it up, like clean the digital footprint.
Clean the digital footprint. That's also something that other companies capitalize on. So I was kind of quite disturbed by that kind of notion of capitalizing on us, not only when we're alive,
also when you're dead. Yeah. And something else that, also struck me, or it was because you mentioned capitalization of people's identities and memories, and also you spoke about the minorities here. I'm going to pull out something that you mentioned in the exhibition guidebook for misbehaving bodies, and I think it was very profound. So you said, and I quote, you said, death is an exaggerated form of life. So if you're poor and you become ill, you will become poorer. Then you go on to say, the economy of marginality people experience over their lives becomes heightened in death. And I thought that this correlation of social status of a person to what their possible condition could be when they are ill, and how that minority or that marginality becomes more pronounced when they are dying, I think was a very astute observation. Can you talk a little bit about this school of thought?
So very, very true. All that happened pre-COVID, but COVID exactly showed us that, exactly demonstrated kind of that injustice or that reality. And at the time, when I was sort of researching for the work and talking to various people, doctor, nurses, digital death experts, people with illnesses, read books, it became clear that certain bodies die in different conditions, and it became clear to me that it's exactly that and that's how I titled the book that came out of this work as well, the Moose publication book. How we die is how we live, only more so. And so, for example, especially people talk a lot about death and loneliness and who is around you when you die and all that. And I think the idea of dying now is becoming more of an art form, if you like, thinking, at least in the West, people think about it perhaps more performatively, more creatively.
Can you elaborate that as a performance or?
So there's a lot more kind of, for example, in North America, I've read in Canada, for example, there's a lot of this sort of quite performative ways of taking pictures with the dead, which have their origin in the kind of origin of photography or the origin of ideas around magic and around kind of seance and that photographing the dead, and different ecologically there are different ways of thinking of burial, kind of ecological burials are more ecologically kind of beneficial to the land. So I think people starting to think around death and dying in slightly more expanded ways. And or for example, I read in Vice magazine that I think in Korea there's this whole genre of people who perform the death for, let's say, they pay money, they go to this kind of, it's like a workshop, and in that workshop is like you pretend that you're dying like tomorrow, let's say. So you go through all the ritual of writing goodbye letters to everybody, and then you're going into a coffin, and there's a whole,
really,
there is oxygen, if you go into Vice you can access it. And the benefit of that, they said that the benefit of that was that it was almost like a life boost. So for 6 months afterwards, people had much more life force, more chi, more energy, like they appreciated life again. So I think we really, I mean, people always done that, but I think death became something more of a taboo in the modern capitalist world, and I think people are now starting to really see it more as a continuum. So, okay, we'll leave, but then also we don't. Sometimes we just die, but sometimes dying itself is a process, you know. So how do I do that? And so yeah, loneliness is profound. Especially, I talk to a lot of nurses about that, and you see that. So if people, for whatever reason, let's say through immigration or exile, found themselves living a lonely life, when they were dying and dead, that became very exaggerated, because nobody came to the hospital to see them, or there was nobody in the funeral, or so these things become quite acute. Same with poverty. You know, if you're poor anyway, let's say you're dying, you can't work anymore, you collect debts, you can't pay for your funeral. You know, like people come in every way. Issues of marginality become exaggerated, either psychologically or financially or through the law, or like, for example, with the LGBTQI plus community, if you're not, let's say, legally married to somebody and you die, where does that leave you in terms of inheritance? Where does that leave you in terms of hospital visits? Who's got priorities? That's also varies from country to country. So that all those kind of inheritance law very much can be very kind of gendered as well. And again, for women, there are other issues that come with that kind of ideas of dying and death, because in certain societies and periods of history, women wouldn't inherit, you know, they were not allowed to inherit anything. All these areas are the ones that I've been thinking about.
I want to connect this directly to misbehaving bodies, because I thought that exhibition that included your work and also Jo Spence's work, and how she had documented her journey through cancer and the treatment and everything that she experienced in the process of that sickness, I think was a very interesting juxtaposition, how one is kind of archiving the process and one who is talking about the ideas of archiving. What were some of the other threads that you thought were emerging out of that exhibition between your work and Jo's work?
Yeah, again, that's a really, really good question. I guess for me, my encounter with her work was when I was a student in the early 90s. I did my BA in Fine Art in Sheffield at the north of England, and I came across her work. And I even found a sketchbook with quotes from her work that I had at the time. So when we were put together in a show, it was quite like an amazing feeling for me because of that history. And that kind of prompted me to look for those sketchbook and find all this kind of stuff that I took from her. And I think at the time, as a young art student, I had like an argument with her in the sketchbook where she talked about illness, and I remember my response. I kind of wrote in response to that in my sketchbook that illness is not a binary, that it's a continuum and spectrum and all that. And so I guess really I had a dialogue with her and her practice, and I found her influential at the time in the way that I guess she dealt with what I've always been interested in, which is narrating one's identity, and how she's done that through mainly photography. And within the exhibition, I think the point of interest was probably the transgenerational dialogue, and how, I guess with my work, issues of technology played a bigger part than when she was alive and made work. So that was one thing. The threads, I guess, were that we both, I'm actually just thinking about it through one of the reviews, the Guardian reviews, because she actually touched on that question. So she talked about how we both a bit kind of, what she said, a bit like shameless, like we not feel shame or guilt to talk about death or to talk about difficult issues or things that are kind of not like a dirty or kind of unpleasant, or we're unapologetic. I think that's the word, like unapologetic in the approach. I think she said that we both don't look at death and illness as a kind of something heroic, or something that you're meant to do politely or nicely. And I think that's really, really important, because I think maybe more in Christian societies, which I don't come from, but I think there is a lot of kind of sense around, at least in the West, around this idea of dying politely, dying nicely, kind of not kind of making too much noise around it, or screaming or arguing, or, just doing it in a dignified way. And David Voronovich, who was an artist who died from AIDS, was talking about that. He said that he didn't want to die politely. He wanted to die with rage. He wanted to shout and scream and, not be polite about it. So I guess that's another, perhaps, I guess we both occupy certain outsiderish positions in some ways in our practices because of all of that and the imagery that we use. The preoccupation itself with illness, that is going quite deep in both cases. And I think the Wellcome collection, the institution was positively surprised by. The exhibition was 8 months. It was so long and it was so busy. And the thing with a subject like this, people just won't come. Who wants to come to an exhibition about death, dying and illness? But actually, there was so much appetite for it, and people spent hours in the space, and they'll take a rest, and then because I had those seats where you could literally sleep, you could it's very important to me that people are comfortable. And I had these huge teddy bears that people were cuddling and falling asleep in, and blankets, and so people could literally spend a long time with the work and kind of in depth, both works. Architecturally, the space was, we thought a lot about those relationships, and we ended up using a kind of perforated fabric. So my work was shown a lot in those kind of tent-like structures, but the fabric was perforated so you could see Spencer's work through my sort of tent structure, so that architecturally the works were divided but kind of perforated, so not kind of softly divided. So that was a nice touch, I think, as well, to the exhibition. We both had our names, so I had my name in the exhibition in a sense handwritten in a very, very large copper plate cutout that was hanging, a bit like a massive kind of jewellery. And hers was a bit more like the Hollywood sign, kind of designing the show in a way that made connections. I think we both had our timeline kind of, I guess our legacy represented in a way there, kind of chronologically. I had a piece there that was also participatory, where I asked people, the question was, do you consider yourself healthy? And people responded. And they responded in those kind of anonymous little piece of paper and put into boxes, which later were performed anonymously by actors. But some of the answers that people gave were influenced by Jo Spencer's presence in the room and her work, and how people felt about her work, and how her work made them think about illness as well, and also her critique of the medical profession and how they kind of infantilized her or dominated her in different ways. And so that was sort of, and I guess my critique was more towards those kind of industries that capitalized on people who are dying. So I guess there was also institutional critique for both of us in the work.
I have it in my notes as well. You said one of the aims of the exhibition was to complicate the binary between health and sickness, and to think of these terms as sliding scale rather than absolute. As our closing question, I wanted to ask you, what do you think is the next possible scenario when it comes to thinking about death, thinking about illness, thinking about, maybe I'll just call the episode on death in the digital age, but where do you think this is heading?
It's hard to predict, but as far as we can predict anything, I think in terms of technology and automation and AI and all that, we're probably moving towards more this idea of avatars, more the ideas of data harvesting, where the creation of posthumously kind of afterlife avatar of ones will become the norm. So the idea that for the loved ones, you could still have a conversation with somebody after they die with the avatar is probably proliferate, the same as we've seen with celebrity culture. So I think that will probably see that. I think laws around, like you were saying about authorships, privacy, in terms of legacy and the virtual world will have to be
formalized. Yeah, I think so too. Yeah.
Particularly, I think, around consensual images, around children's presence on non-consensual kind of appearance of presence of people on, including children and animals, on social media, for example. I think the performativity and ritual sense of death, like theme-based funerals, and that will grow more. The sort of technologically hybrid forms of memorialization, whether it's ashes, using of ashes, whether it's ecological barriers, burials, whether it's gravestones will develop. So yeah, I think it's just like life. The presence of technology and various technological intelligences will become more apparent as it is in life.
Yeah. Thank you for this conversation, Oreet. I think I was really looking forward to this, and this is something that I really want to talk about, because we talk about health and we talk about medicine and we talk about care, but we don't talk about death as often. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your brilliant engagement and questions.
Special thanks to Ayushi Thakur for the research and design support, and Kahan Shah for the background score. You can follow us on Instagram at arcofcenter and reach out to us through our website arcofcenter.com. That is ARCHOFFCENTRE. And thanks for listening.